Everybody, today for the forum, we are considering the third pillar of biblical justice: no one is beyond redemption. We have with us a guest speaker today, Dr. Eli McCarthy. He is a professor in justice and peace studies at Georgetown University. He's also the author of several books on the ethics of peace building, and he is also the founder of the DC Peace Team, which works in select DC neighborhoods to build peace infrastructures for nonviolent communication, including things like restorative justice, nonviolent communication, community mediation, unarmed protection units, and the like. And these these concepts all focus at their core on empathy and humanization, which are also key components in our consideration of today's topic. So just a couple housekeeping items. If everyone could have their mutes on mic or their mics on mute, or Bill, if you could mute everyone. And then after Dr. McCarthy's remarks, we'll have a short reflection in a breakout room, and then we'll all come back for a Q&A session. And as Bill mentioned, as people were joining, you can just put your questions in the chat or raise your hand under participant, and Bill can call on you so that we can see everyone that's asking questions. So with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. McCarthy. Welcome.
Right, thank you, Lisa. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful to be with you. Really grateful for the invitation to share with you as part of this really critical series on racial justice. I'm so glad to see this kind of work happening. I've been asked to share a bit about the theme that no one is beyond redemption. So the title of my thoughts today is The Everlasting Open Arms of Our God. The everlasting open arms of our God. And Jesus helps us to see that our God is a loving God, a God whose arms are always open to embrace us as God's children, as sacred gifts, and even with our moments of sin. So when I was a little boy, around 10 or 11, I began to notice some harm that was occurring in my family and kind of wonder about peacemaking. I wondered because at times I would hear my mother and my stepfather argue, and it was pretty consistent. And I recall sitting in sort of hidden areas of the house, kind of listening to words and tone of these arguments, and kind of squinting when I heard something that was gonna make things worse, and wondering what might make the relations a bit better. A mix of kind of alcoholism in the relationship led to an experience on my own of feeling like I was kind of regularly walking on eggshells when I was in the house. And I just wondered, what is peacemaking anyways? Is it even possible? And what does it really look like? So as I started to go through middle school and high school, I also gradually became aware of some of the racial issues in our community, where the school I was at, although I lived in a very small town, like 300 people, the school I was at was predominantly white. We had maybe one or two Black students, and the school kind of in the nearby neighborhood or vicinity was almost all Black or persons of color. And then I was on the basketball team, and I remember like our biggest rivalry was sort of our school against this other mostly Black school. And there were times it got pretty intense. I remember the fans getting real intense with each other, and even the players at times, there would be scuffles or sometimes fights that broke out during the game. And it was just a memory that's kind of sat with me. And another thing that happened when I was younger was I was part of I remembered a friend of mine named Ryan Strayhorn, who was the one Black kid in my grade. We were part of a talent show together. We did dance to Bobby Brown, My Prerogative. And I remember practicing in his house with his parents, and it was a thrill. But you know, now I look back and I recall how distinct that was, I guess, in the space that I was growing up in. So as I got towards the end of high school, you know, my stepfather had some issues with drinking and ended up spending some time in jail for a bit, but he started to sober up and he started to turn around. We started to talk about family, about his relationship with my mom, just about life in general. And I had this like experience where I sensed the possibility of transformation in a really, what appeared to me, a very unlikely person to change. I started to see the light of redemption. So as I went on, I ended up going to grad school and studying religious ethics and peace studies out at Berkeley, California, at the Graduate Theological Union. And I started to learn about nonviolence and through people like Francis of Assisi, but also Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Dorothy Day. And it was there where I first came across this practice called unarmed civilian protection. I never really heard about this before. And one of the groups that I first learned about was the Nonviolent Peace Force. And they're actually the largest group in the world right now that does this kind of a professional level. And I'm going to share with you a short video. I'm going to put it in the chat box. And if you want to click on this link or copy and paste it into your URL, and we'll just stay on mute and everybody can watch it. It's about 2 minutes. Gives you a little introduction to this practice and how this is working in some tough spots like South Sudan, Iraq, Colombia, Philippines, and so forth. So go ahead and give it a watch.
At the beginning of the 20th century.
All right, should be pretty close to wrapping that up. If you didn't get a chance to watch it, I'll provide the link here in a little bit on a document that you can use later. But so you can see that this organization is doing amazing things. There's a couple stories in South Sudan that I want to elaborate on. One was that you notice how they were accompanying women who were just going to get water and firewood. They'd have to walk a couple miles or more. And their presence was able to prevent what was a regular incidence of sexual assault or violence that happened to these women by all the different armed actors in the war. The second kind of story they started to mention was the two men, Derek and Andreas, there was an attack on a UN compound by armed militia. People were running and fleeing. About 50 people ended up getting shot. And this group of 14 women and children ran into this mud hut with these two NP officers. And the armed militia broke in and said, hey, we want these people, you two, get out of here, talking to the NP officers. And they could have very easily, just been shot and that was it. But they stood up and they said, listen, we're nonpartisan, we're humanitarian, we're not going to leave. So there was a decision, and the armed militia decided to back out. They came back 2 more times with the same demand, got the same response, and these women and children ended up surviving that particular attack. So these kinds of experiences led to developing a group called the DC Peace Team in 2010. I came back to DC after grad school. I had been learning about these groups. We started a short version of the Berkeley Peace Team for a few months, and then I came here and started working at a parish as a social justice minister. And I met this person named Cortez McDaniel. I'm going to show you a picture of him. So Cortez was a person that had spent a lot of time kind of on the streets in DC growing up. He was involved in some gangs, some violence, even some killings, selling drugs and so forth. And he ended up spending time in jail. And during that time, he had a sense, he started to recognize how much the people around him were being impacted and kind of struggling and even getting worse. So he started to think about how he could try to help them. Created some different sessions and programs. And when he got out, he decided he really wanted to do something constructive in the community. So he was working at the McKenna Center, which is a place in DC that works with people who live on the streets or come out of prison. And I got to know him through our social justice work. And he kind of shared his story. And, I was kind of like, wow, this is the kind of person who has that street credibility that could really start to impact communities in a more positive way. And this was something that Cure Violence, which is another major unarmed protection organization, does. They hire these street credible people to be what they call violence interrupters. So Cortez and I took a training with the Nonviolent Peace Force, and afterwards he was like, this is it. We got to create this here in DC. This is what we really need. And he wanted to be a part of it and help kind of generate it. So the vision and purpose of the Peace Team is to cultivate these habits and skills of nonviolence in our daily life so that our communities can become increasingly nonviolent and resistant to injustice, and thus build a more sustainable, just peace. So we do 3 buckets of activities. One is skill training. Lisa mentioned nonviolent communication, which is like interpersonal conflict, bystander intervention. If you're just kind of out in public or at an event and somebody starts getting harmed or hurt, how can you intervene as a bystander? Unarmed protection, I'll say a little more about that in a moment. Restorative justice, and nonviolence and meditation. We've done these trainings in New York, San Antonio, California, even over in China one summer. And 5 of our main leaders at this point are Black persons drawing on their experience. The second main set of activities is unarmed civilian protection units. So we send these to neighborhood situations like Gallery Place in DC, where youth have sometimes been in some tussles or gotten into fights, but also police have been harassing the youth. So we would monitor and intervene on occasion. A second form of this is we have a accompaniment team that is providing protection to a Black woman who's a congressional candidate in the Midwest, and she's been getting a lot of death threats and things that have happened to her, letters and her car was run off the road at one point. And then thirdly, we send these teams to political demonstrations particularly where there's counter protests. We're there to try to prevent or interrupt dehumanization, prevent direct violence, and also try to build empathy when we can. So these have been things like the Republican National Convention in 2016 in Cleveland, the Mexican border, Tijuana and San Diego for migrant issues. In DC, the Unite the Right rally, Black Lives Matter marches, the March for Life, and so forth. And then lastly, we do restorative justice circles. So these are for all sorts of groups. We've done them at the McKenna Center for the men who are kind of living on the streets. We've done these for parishes and congregations who have had internal issues or issues between different workers in the community. The birth worker community has also had us do some circles. So these are great for prevention, but also kind of healing after harm. So those are the three things we do. And I'm going to share with you now a summary document, which kind of is going to capture some of the things that I'm going to share today and just kind of give you some notes if you want to take away. So it's in the chat box. It's a Google Doc. If you just click on it or copy and paste the URL, you'll see some of these points that we're going to kind of go through. So one of the key themes for our work at DC Peace Team is how do we grow in nonviolence? So there's kind of 4 aspects, and you'll see these on your document that I just want to highlight. And these are taken from models like Lema Gabawi, who led the nonviolent movement in Liberia to end the 2003 Civil War, and Dorothy Day, and so forth. So the first one is that nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. So this is really about practicing it in our daily life, making it a habit or a virtue with how we interact with our family, our friends, our coworkers, what we consume. The second one is that nonviolence seeks understanding and movement toward partnership. So we saw this with Gandhi's relationship with Britain as he resisted the colonial empire and then was able to kind of leave. British were able to leave in a pretty amicable relationship. But also King talks about this in terms of loving connection rather than hate, because King and others recognize that we don't want to reinscribe this us versus them mentality, because that ultimately becomes the seed to more violence. Third, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. So we try as best we can to separate the action from the person. And this often throws the adversary off balance. They're expecting hostility or humiliation or even direct violence in return. So David Hartsoe has this example when he was part of the sit-ins in the 60s during the civil rights movement, and he was in a restaurant doing a sit-in, and a man breaks into the restaurant with a knife and takes it up to David's heart and says, "Hey, you got 1 minute to get out of here, or I'm going to run this knife through your heart." David takes a breath and he says, "You do what you have to, and I'm going to try and love you just the same." The man with the knife, his hands started to shake, and he started to step back, and he turns and he walks out of the restaurant, because David was able to separate the action of violence from the person whose dignity still remains. Fourth, nonviolence holds that voluntary suffering to resist injustice and violence can create a breakthrough and transform the conflict. So we've seen examples like the March on Selma, but also today with Black Lives Matter marches where people offer nonviolent civil disobedience. The idea is that when we risk suffering through nonviolence, it helps to expose and contrast in a very clear way the injustice and violence on one side and the more justice and nonviolence on the other side. So this is not saying, of course, that suffering in itself is good, or anyone who's being harmed should simply be passive and accept the suffering. Also on your document there, you see a little broader working description of nonviolence. I'll just highlight that we see it as a positive reverence for dignity and life, a spirituality, as well as an intersectional approach to social issues. So I'm going to share with you one other story that we often share in our work, and this is a story about Antoinette Tubb, who lived in Georgia. And this person on the right broke into the school she was working at. It was a middle school, elementary middle school. And he had a lot of guns on him. It looked like it was going to be another school shooting. All the kids are running outside. The faculty's running outside. The police eventually come up outside, and some shots are exchanged between this gunman and the police. And Antoinette does something remarkable. She's in the administrative office as a staff person. And for her, she starts to center herself. And she does this by saying a short prayer. And she says that out of that moment, she was able to not see him as a monster or irrational, but as a human being. So she gets on the phone with the 911 operator. And she's listening to what this other person is doing on the phone. The guy with the guns, he's also talking on the phone. And she starts to recognize that somebody else on that other line appears, from what she could tell, cares about him, has some concern for him. So she says this to him. She says, it sounds like they really care for you. They're really concerned about you. And he's a little bit shocked. He's like, But he starts to open up. He says, yeah, I didn't take my medication this morning. I should have done that. So she tells the 911 operator, she's like, got to tell the police not to take him to prison or to jail, but he needs to go to the hospital. But she realizes if he goes out, it's a pretty good chance he would get shot right away. So she says, I will walk outside with you and take that risk. And she starts to share a little bit more of her own suffering, about her own divorce, about her struggle raising a disabled son. She's increasingly rehumanizing him. And soon after that, he goes on the intercom and he apologizes to the kids for scaring them. And he starts to put down some of his weapons. He still had enough on him, though. But she senses he's going into the space of possible shame. So she says, we will not hate you. I'm proud of you. She even says, I love you. And then she goes deeper in her own vulnerability and talks about her own past suicide attempt. And it's in these depths of vulnerability that he finally says to her, my name is Michael. This was the power of nonviolence. And even though Antoinette then invited the police into the school, there's a flood of chaotic yelling and threatening and hostility, but nobody gets shot. And you can imagine if Antoinette had come with the same threat and hostility, her, maybe some of the children, police could have been harmed, if not killed. So this is, one of those amazing stories that can at least broaden our imagination about what might be possible. We invite you, if you want to, do more with the DC Peace team, to go to our webpage, and there's an e-list you can sign up for, dcpeaceteam.com. And there's also a network around the US and Canada called the Shanti Sena Network of peace teams in different cities, including Cure Violence and some other groups. So I want to wrap up just these initial thoughts with saying just a few words about the Just Peace framework, which is really a framework that grows out of these experiences that I've talked about. But particularly, I was at a conference in Italy in 2016, and voices of Christians who were living in violent conflict zones, South Sudan, Iraq, Colombia, different countries came and kind of shared and said, you know, we need Christians to do more about preventing war. We need to help Christians. We need Christians to support us, particularly large Christian institutions, to go beyond these kind of ways of signaling that war could be just, or preparing for such wars. We need to shift the church, broadly understood, towards focusing on peace and nonviolence. And this Just Peace ethic kind of grew out of those voices. So you'll see, I'll just pull up a link here to kind of show you briefly, but as part of this ethic or this framework, there's kind of, you know, 3 buckets of categories, like developing virtues and skills to engage conflict well, breaking cycles of destructive conflict and violence, and building sustainable peace. And the idea is that our actions and strategies should enhance these norms, or at least not obstruct them. Just a couple points about the racial justice elements is in the first category, there's a norm called educating and training in key skills, and one of those is racial analysis or intersectional analysis. You'll see that in the footnotes below. And then in the third category, building sustainable peace, the very last norm listed there is economic, gender, and racial justice as well. So you're welcome to kind of check that out a little bit more if you like. But this, from the meeting in Italy, led to an initiative from Pax Christi International called the Catholic Nonviolence Initiative, which has really been trying to move the Catholic institution in this direction. And there's a link there on your document if you want to see more. nonviolencejustpeace.net, but it's also an ecumenical movement. You know, the World Council of Churches wrote 2011 and 2013 a document called An Ecumenical Call to Just Peace, and then there's an elaboration on that a couple years later. The UCC churches had these going since the 80s, these sort of just peace congregations, and a lot of scholars have been writing about it. So finally, there's a book of case studies on your summary doc. Many of these voices that I mentioned earlier wrote case studies about their experience and how, and kind of drawing on a just peace ethic to think about how they could transform the conflict in their particular zones. So it's called a Just Peace Ethic Primer is the book. So finally, just to wrap up, some possible racial justice action steps to kind of think about. You know, I think one is it's really important to become aware of our deeper needs and our conflicts, and this is what nonviolent communication can help us do, but it also helps us become more aware of the needs of others in our conflicts. And when we do this and we kind of focus in on trying to develop personal relationships with Black or Indigenous people of color, kind of listening to their stories and experience with this NVC lens, so we can get a more empathetic sense of the needs behind these experiences. And then coupling that with thinking systematically. You know, what are the systems, the policies, laws, programs that are either enabling or profiting off the harm? And how can we start to work to change some of them? So it's important as we do the systemic work to be kind of in the process of personal reflection and education. There's a good book called White Fragility. You could also think about doing restorative circles on themes like white privilege or racial equity. You might even think about creating your own local peace team for your parish or sort of the neighborhoods around your parish, where you offer training in some of these nonviolent skills, provide protection teams for certain events, offer circles around key conflicts or situations. And then the last two things is part of the systemic change, which is really important, is to the extent that we have impact on people's wages, to try to pay living wages, not just minimum wages, but wages that can help people meet all of their basic needs and flourish. So you can find statistics for that on what the living wage in DC is as well. And then the last link on there is from the Shanti Sena network. So that is the network of peace teams, but there's also a brief there called Alternative Community Protection. And you can look up some of the different things that have been happening in this movement towards reimagining how we do protection in our communities, but also some ideas of ways that that could go forward as well. So let me wrap up and just say, to live out the recognition that no one is beyond redemption really invites us to increasingly become nonviolent people and to shift our moral framework for conflict from just war to just peace. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much for those remarks. You've given us a lot to think about and digest. And I think you were suggesting that we just do a little bit, 5-6 minutes of discussion in a breakout room amongst ourselves and then come back.
Yeah, I think that would be great.
Bill, Tech Master, can you do it?
Let's see. So,
And, you can think about like what you noticed so far, and then, any kind of questions that are coming up or sort of next steps that you're thinking about perhaps for your community.
okay, I'm going to put us into 7 rooms, which is 3 or 4 people per room. And there'll be a notice. I'll set a notice, so you'll get a notice when it's time to come back, and then we'll bring you all back. So I'm sorry, Eli, you're thinking what, 5 minutes? Is that about right?
5 minutes should be good.
Okay. Okay. You all should have been invited to join a room. Just you can just speak up if you're having any trouble. I see some folks aren't quite in there yet. Eli, I'm going to stay out. I know you could join a room or stay out yourself, depending on what you'd like to do. Eli, I don't know what we usually get a fair amount of questions in these forums. I'll just pose one you might address when we come back. One of the things that's been a very active theme on our forums, thus far has been the whole political situation. I don't know if it. Fortunately, I'm not sure we're at least not very violent, but lots of conflict. And I'm wondering, I think it might be very interesting to the group what the work you're doing or you're seeing done, how that applies to that context, particularly as we go into the election, where I think the opportunity for real disruption is very, very substantive. So.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I can mention we've had some trainings this month. We've got a couple coming up on like election scenarios that do like bystander intervention or unarmed protection kind of deployment. So
Mhm.
I can mention that. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of groups working on that in
Yeah.
different ways. So it's a lot of like energy and I think some anxiety in folks. And,
Yeah, I think last week it was very interesting. I mean, we really focused on the political situation. One of the things I think some folks were really articulating was their own personal challenges. I think when you're talking about coming at it from a place of forgiveness or even love, I think a lot of people were sharing just how much they're having difficulty controlling their own feelings, even their own rage at the situation. So a lot of struggle. I think I'm going to give folks, what should we say, a 2-minute warning or a 3-minute warning?
yeah, 2 minutes is good, I think.
Okay.
I used to work at a high school in the Boston area, and we would take our students up for retreats in Vermont pretty regularly. It was at the, I think it was a Benedictine monastery up there.
Okay.
I forget what it was called, but
Yeah, we enjoy it. I grew up in DC, and I always wanted to live in the snow belt. I still haven't managed it, but we get to visit at least. So, and I'm a skier, so we're near Killington in the middle of the state. I will say if there's such a thing, one blessing of COVID is that neither Lisa nor I are in the office. So, and our kids are now both out of the house, so we can just come up here whenever we want. So it's kind of liberating. That's how I can pull off 3 weeks.
yeah, that's great. Yeah, I enjoyed my time in Boston for sure. But I think once I lived in California for 5 years, it's like hard to imagine being in a colder environment on a regular basis.
Yeah.
We do head up to Boston pretty regularly.
Great. Okay, I think maybe I'll close the rooms out and bring folks back. Does that sound good?
Yep. Sounds good.
Well, I'm happy to say this has been our smoothest Zoom meeting yet. We've had a lot of account issues and a little bit of a learning curve for me. So we're having a good Sunday so far.
Yeah, that's great. It's always a relief not have to deal with technology struggles.
Yep. So where are you from originally, Eli?
I was actually born in Georgetown Hospital and lived in Northern Virginia until I was about 10.
Okay. Where in Virginia?
Alexandria.
Okay. I grew up in Centerville.
Gotcha.
Okay, here. I think folks are all coming back in now.
Thank you. It worked.
Excellent.
How was everybody's breakout group? Anybody, we can open up now for discussion. We have about 20 minutes left.
Speaking for breakout room 4, where we were by ourselves, we concluded that it's a very challenging prospect to exert the amount of discipline that's needed to respond peacefully in these situations.
Speaking for breakout room 2, I would say that we noticed how graphic your examples were relative to the question of, can people be redeemed? So that's the beginning of the approach, and we would welcome some training to help us understand what it would take as individuals to be part of a group, whether we can act on it or not. So we put that to our leaders. Is there a way to do that?
Hey, Barbara, it's Anne. And I think that's really something worth exploring. I think it's really a way of putting into action some of the work we did on civil discourse earlier in our forum series and some of our other sessions, maybe in a more concrete way. It certainly couldn't hurt to have that training. Use it, and not just in our church life, but in, you know, our life outside in the world, our personal lives.
That came up in our group as well. And one thought too is to do maybe a restorative circle on white privilege and look at that a little bit more. You know, we've had the book study with Sari, you know, that is moving forward, and maybe as part of like future programming, we could include something like that, or also what Barbara just mentioned.
Mm-hmm. I don't remember what room I was in, but I was there with my good friend Denise Corrado, and we talked mostly about how hard it is and that for people to actually listen to other people, and why that is. You know, why is it so hard for us to be, you know, truly deep listeners to others? I mean, even in our church training for Stephen ministry and things like that, we spend a lot of time learning how to be really good active listeners, and we all need that training. But Eli, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Why is it so hard? Why do we have to intentionally and affirmatively learn to listen?
Yeah, I think it's a really good point, and definitely a big challenge today with lots of information flowing and choices about where we're going to give our attention. You know, makes it even harder, I think, to kind of pause and listen. But you know, I think one of the really helpful insights I've found, particularly with nonviolent communication, is a big part of being able to do other empathy or listening to others well is to really get clearer about what's going on within each of us. So we call that self-empathy, right? Like what am I really feeling in this conflict, and what need is beneath my struggle? Is it about respect or acknowledgement or support or connection or sense of integrity or play? I mean, there's a whole chart of human needs that we share with people, but the more I can get clear about that, the better equipped and kind of better positioned I am to try to be receptive to what else might be going on for the other persons. And when we can get clear on those needs, then we can try to make more specific requests that actually get the needs met, rather than sort of getting stuck in, you know, trying to defend one's either political position or one's behavior, which are, you know, ultimately strategies for trying to get these needs met. So I think the self-empathy piece is really important, and certainly centering is something we do in all of our trainings, or whether that's prayer or meditation or taking deep breaths. That's a really crucial practice just on a regular basis to kind of equip us for those more difficult moments.
Mm-hmm.
Those would be some thoughts. I'm sure there's other points others might want to make.
So Eli, I'll bring up a question that came up on the chat from Jay. Jay, if it's okay, with you, I'll just read it. Have you been influenced by the theologian Walter Wink, and what does he think of Wink? What do you think of Wink's writings on nonviolence?
Yeah, it's a great question. Definitely the answer is yes. I've read a lot of Walter Wink. I think one of the more helpful pieces that I found was when I was first kind of trying to understand the turn the other cheek part of the scriptures where Jesus is telling those stories. And, you know, there was a tendency for me and others around me to think of that meant passivity and just kind of allowing people to kind of oppress you or beat you down. And Wink was really good at helping me and many others understand that that was really a story. When you look at the social cultural situation of turning your right cheek, it meant that if the oppressor was gonna hit you again, that the person being oppressed was essentially saying, listen, you can't hit me with a backhand. You can't treat me like an oppressed person. If you're gonna hit me, you treat me like an equal, which, because in that culture, they didn't use the left hand, right? They would have used the right hand. So if I get hit on the right cheek, I would have had to like go around like that, right? So he helped us to see that this was about Jesus teaching and inviting the people who are oppressed to assert their dignity. And this is one of the first key moments in generating a character in a community that can develop nonviolent resistance to oppression, is the assertion of one's, or recognition of one's dignity. So those stories were really about, you know, not using violent resistance, but kind of the depths of what nonviolence was. And he wrote a lot of other great things about the domination of powers. And so forth.
Right.
I'll pick up another one from Annalise in the chat. So in a discussion of redemption, the American system of incarceration and its emphasis on retribution over rehabilitation, dignity and restorative justice seems lost. In our current system, the dignity of the individual is subverted. How do we shift the culture of human destruction that is present in the system to one that values respect, dignity, and rehabilitation? Any thoughts on that, Dr. McCarthy?
Yeah, we definitely have a huge problem with our criminal justice system and the mass incarceration and the racial injustice that is throughout all of it. And there are actually like really good signs in certain parts of the US that are starting to change this. So in DC, for example, the juvenile justice system and even the DC public schools have really been one of the leaders in piloting restorative justice circles and programs. And that's starting to have a huge impact on how students are much less likely to get suspended or expulsion, creating student leaders who can kind of run these circles. Other places like Colorado, California, New York have some really high quality restorative justice programs that are happening. So I think there are some really good signs that it's moving in that direction. You know, we just need to keep learning more about it and getting trained and running these things at the local level, and that's going to gradually start to impact the larger kind of state and national level. There's also a number of groups that have been doing different forms of truth commissions, particularly around racial justice. So like there's one called the Truth Telling Project that came out of Ferguson after Michael Brown was shot. There's a number of other groups that are kind of working on trying to put that together, either in certain localities or regions, and eventually perhaps at a national level. Barbara Lee is actually a congresswoman from Oakland, California, who developed some legislation about a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, particularly on racial justice issues. So there's a lot of good signs, but we just need to keep kind of learning, training, offering, and advocating for it.
And if I could add, to follow up on that, how do we think systemically? Like you were discussing, do we try to dissect like a very narrow issue and advocate on that? Or is it better to make broad noise about, you know, the need for reform of criminal justice system? Or is it more just to think out and ferret out what it is and then take smaller actions?
Well, I think one of the key steps of thinking systemically is first identifying like who's most affected by the systemic injustice that you're looking at. So if it's going to be a racial justice issue, then, you know, which communities of color or Black persons are most impacted by these, and then spending some time with people in those communities, either over meals or through common encounters, service projects or something, to kind of really get to know them and learn their stories and experiences. And, you know, as that trust is built, then, you know, asking how you can be supportive, like what would help them in their work to, you know, deal with either mass incarceration or you know, some of the more specific policies that are related to that. I mean, I think that's one crucial step. I mean, one of the challenges sometimes for me, and I think other people who might be privileged or be white, is that we kind of got a great idea and we want to go in and like make it happen and control the process and get it done quickly. And, you know, that could make a good bump in the situation in the short term, but in the long term, we still kind of get stuck in a bit of a kind of dominant paradigm. And we really need to try to break out of that as best we can, even if it takes a little longer or if there's, you know, other bumps in the road, but that'll be like the more sustainable way to kind of go about it. I mean, there's a lot of good groups here in DC, like Showing Up for Racial Justice, for example, is working closely with the Black community and Black Lives Matter to focus on like DC Council kind of policy. Being in Bethesda, you know, Montgomery County, you've got a lot of good groups that are working on this. So just developing the right coalitions and the trust.
Yeah, it's Mark. I think building coalitions is something I'm hugely in favor of. I think doing things by ourselves is often just duplicating other people's efforts, and you know, go where the action is and join forces. But one of the things you suggest in that is to build local peace teams as part of a racial justice effort, and that it seems to suggest that training is one way to think about that. How, if we wanted to do that, how would we go about doing that? What kind of training is there, and is this something that you know our parish can participate in?
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for the question. So we have about 4-hour introductory trainings in nonviolent communication would probably be the place to start, and then either bystander intervention, restorative circles, unarmed protection would be other kind of 4-hour intros. And once, you know, you kind of get some experience with that, you know, then you could identify people who might want to learn to lead some of these trainings. And we could do like a training for trainers so that people in your community could then lead these trainings. That would kind of be the training piece. And then in terms of like creating a peace team, you know, I think during the training process and more broadly, trying to invite other stakeholders in the area into those trainings and into sort of imagining what the role of the peace team would be. So again, people who are, you know, more affected by different injustices, Black, Indigenous, people of color that you might have some relationships with, more they can be included along the process, probably the better. And sure, you know, there's a lot to learn from those communities as well.
Indeed. Anyone else who hasn't had a chance to talk? Bill, I see one coming up in the chat.
Yes, I think Jay would like some more reading. So what reading should Jay do from a Christian perspective? And then he can share with us in an upcoming forum. What are your suggestions, Dr. McCarthy?
Related to a particular topic, like you want to specify that a little bit more?
Shall I call you out, Jay?
Unmute.
I'm sorry, you're gonna make me unmute and everybody's gonna hear the raucous sounds of my garden. You know, just for background, there's so much to read. Certainly on race, there's so much. You mentioned one book, and these days there's dozens more. You know, I thought Walter Wink and some other people like that were really helpful in a different kind of look at the Christian faith. But you know, are you looking? My son just finished the autobiography of Malcolm X. But you mentioned Dorothy Day and other people. You know, where are you turning for inspiration?
Well, I think the story of Lema Gabawi is a really profound one. If you haven't heard of her, she was a Christian woman in Liberia, and she joined with other Muslim women to create a nonviolent resistance movement against Charles Taylor and a really horrible civil war that was going on there. And there's a movie about her called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. And you know, she eventually, I think, won the Nobel Peace Prize, and they elected the first African woman president after they got rid of Taylor. I'm not sure if there's a book yet on her story, but there certainly is that documentary, which is really good. You know, I think other people, I mean, I think Thomas Merton is always a great one to go back to. More recently, you know, Brian Stevenson has some good stuff. I think it's called Just Mercy or something like that. It's really about, you know, the criminal justice system, but Christian perspective.
Eli, I think maybe I'll just offer a comment in terms of what I took away from this this morning. I think I was most moved by the example you gave of the school shooting situation, and I don't really think it's a perfect analogy, but the need to find humanity in the source of your threat or your adversary, if you want to think of that. And I'm going to take that away. I think the you know, as I mentioned while others were in the chat room, in the current political context with such heated feelings on both sides, and I think a genuine, real perception of threat, that is a very challenging thing to do. And so one of the things I'll just take as a personal commitment is, even as I strive for the outcome that I'm looking for, to try to always perceive the other side as humans, maybe deeply misguided humans, but humans nonetheless. So thank you for that insight.
Thanks, Bill. Appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this Sunday. You've certainly given us a lot to think about, and what I can hear from what's coming up in all of the breakout rooms, we are going to have a lot to talk about. Next Sunday at 11, everybody, Sari will be running a discussion about what we heard today. So bring your ideas, thoughts, and reflections, and let's just see where we can all go together.
And thank you.
Sorry, please.
Thank you so much. It was great to meet you all. I really appreciate your insights and comments. So look forward to walking with you more on this journey of faith and hope.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you
Everyone
so much.
have a great week.
Have a wonderful weekend. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Take care.
Oh, there you are.
Okay, guys, I'm going to go ahead and end the meeting unless anyone has a final comment or thought.
You did a great job again, Bill. Thank you.
All right, folks, have a great week.
Bill, thank you.
Bye.
Everyone, thank you, Dr. McCarthy.
Thanks,
Thank
Lisa.
you.